Hello, in today's video I'll be giving you some great top tips on how to photograph wildflowers. So for my first tip, which is more of a rule really, is never pick wildflowers. Now this is extremely important because as soon as you pick them they'll start to die, and even in a vase at home they're only going to last a few hours, maybe a few days. But if you leave them on the plant they'll live a lot longer, they'll set a seed and they'll be able to reproduce, and it will give all the wildlife and things like that a chance. And also the beauty isn't there just for you, it's so everyone else can see it as well. It's really good to get right down and change your perspective when photographing wildflowers. We generally see them when we're standing up, so about 5 or 6 foot off the ground. But if you get really low down and get it from the same point of view as the flower itself, you get some amazing viewpoints, and you can get some detail in there and different angles that you wouldn't see normally to your eye, and it would look a lot better. And that should give you a different photograph to the ones you would normally think of. However, there is one word of caution. When you're getting down low to these plants, be very careful, because one, you don't want to kneel on them and kill them, and two, you don't want to kneel in any dog poo either. I've found these really beautiful little flowers down here. They look and smell like wild garlic, but they're slightly different. So normally wild garlic is more of a umbrella for shut type shape, and it just spreads out, whereas these are generally quite singular flowers. So I'm not entirely sure what they are, but they do smell like garlic, so it might be part of the allium family somewhere along the line. But these flowers are really beautiful. I found a lovely one down here, and it's quite a graphical image because the stem goes up and then it just shoots off at 2 quite strong angles. So I've got that as close as I can to the plane of the film to get as much of it in focus, and then I've got a shallow depth of field to try and blur out the background, and then I think that should look really stunning. As beautiful as flowers are, a photograph will really be enhanced by adding something extra, like an insect or something like that. I've found probably one of the most annoying weeds, or wildflowers I should say, in the UK, which is the dandelion. It can be quite pretty. It's very bright yellow, and you get masses of them in fields and things, and then you get lovely seed heads after the flowers have died, but they just seem to get everywhere. So if you own a garden, you'll know that these are a right pain. But I've just come across this one. So as you can see, I'm right in close with a 70-300 lens. I've got 2 extension tubes, and I'm zooming right in. I'm probably about 5 inches, maybe 6 inches away from this plant. But what is spectacular about this is there's this tiny little bee that's sitting on one of the petals. It's holding on, and it's just, the petals drop down, and it just seems to be hanging on to this little petal, and it looks so beautiful. It's so tiny, the actual bee itself is probably that sort of size, so it's really difficult to get the depth of field. Every time I'm trying to get up close to it and focus, just tapping the focus ring blows it right out of focus. So automatic is completely out, so I'm just doing manual focus, and the slightest turn, if I could just tap it, it will go through the whole width of this bee. But it looks so brilliant. I've taken a number of different photos, changed the focus slightly on each time, and then hopefully I've got one that's in focus. So for the sharp-eyed people, you might have noticed in that last clip, I had a little bug that landed on my head and took a big chunk of bite out the top of my head, and that really hurt. It was there, probably still there now, and that was a week ago. So I have said it before and I'll say it again, wildflower photography can be extremely dangerous. So when out photographing wildflowers, always take precautions and remember that safety is very important. So for my next photograph, I've found this lovely clump of white flowers next to me, and what I want to do is try and get it really close and get a picture of one flower which is perfectly in focus, and then all the other flowers and foliage behind it really blurred. So down here we've got some lovely little white campion, and just here is this beautiful little spider. So I focus right in on this little spider, and because the depth of field is very narrow, it's put the petals out of focus. So the one at the front hopefully will be in focus enough so you can see the stamen and things in there, but the other one behind it, behind the actual spider, will be really blurred, so that will really help to make the spider stand out against these petals. When photographing flowers, it isn't always the best time to photograph them in flower. Now, dandelions aren't my favourite flower, and I must admit they're not very pretty. However, if you photograph them a later time or find some that have seed heads on them, they look a lot more spectacular, and I find the seed heads of a dandelion look far more beautiful than the actual flowers. So if you can get up early enough to catch some dew on the flowers, you get these little droplets which can look absolutely spectacular. However, if you are a bit too late, like today it's in the middle of the day, I've just bought a little misting bottle, just filled it full of water, and then just spray the flowers with a couple of sprays, and then you get some tiny little water droplets, and that will help to make the flower even more interesting. So when using a macro lens, you're very close to the subject and everything is magnified to a great deal. So any slight movement or breeze that knocks a flower will just completely blur the image. One thing that I found essential for photographing wildflowers is this little windbreak I've made. And this is just 4 pieces of perspex stuck together with some duct tape. So you've got 3 sides and the roof. And what that does is that creates a really bright environment to photograph the flowers in, and the front is open and it lets all the light in but stops the wind. So I think this is probably the most useful thing that I use for photographing wildflowers. I've made another video on how I made this perspex windbreak, and I'll put a link to that above so you can see how I've made it in case you want to make one of your own. One thing that I find extremely important when photographing wildflowers is the type of lens you use. Now in this case this is a telephoto lens which is 70 to 300, but unfortunately this isn't very good for photographing wildflowers, and that is because the minimum focusing distance of this lens is probably 1.5 to 2 meters, something like that. So you have to go so far away from the flower that the flower itself will be minuscule. So what you need is a macro lens. A macro lens is essentially very similar to a telephoto lens. However, the point of focus is a lot closer to the lens than with a normal telephoto. So what that allows you to do is get it extremely close to a flower, so a few inches away from that flower, so you can get it really big in the frame. One of the disadvantages of a macro lens is that it's only really useful for photographing things that are close up. If you want to photograph a landscape or something a long way away, the depth of field is so small because of the way the focus is created on it. So I don't find them very practical for most of the time. But the second point, and most important for me, is that they are expensive, and the amount of use that I would get out of it is very minimal, so it's not something I actually own. So instead of having a macro lens, what I use are extension tubes. And what you do with these is you place these between the camera body and the lens, and in this case we've got 3 different ones, and these just come apart so you can stack them up and have them as many as you like. So the more you have of these, the further it pushes the lens away from the sensor, so the closer that the lens will focus, but the depth of field will get dramatically short. So what I'll do is just, usually a couple of these is good enough. So just take off your lens, pop it on, and then pop that back on, and that distance there just pushes your lens away from the sensor, and you can get really close in on your subjects at a fraction of the price. When you've got these stacked up, your depth of field is probably a millimetre if you're lucky, if you're really close up to that subject. So what I'll do is I'll just, on the back of the camera, just click on the magnifying glass a couple of times, and then so it's zoomed in on your subject, and then just slowly turn the ring manually, and then focus on the exact bit that you want to focus on. Even if you have a smartphone such as this has a lovely camera on it, you can get it really close with these, because the way the lenses and everything's built into the phone, you can get really close to your subject. And if that's not even close enough, you can buy these little lenses here, and this is a little macro lens that you just clip onto the back of the phone, and that will enable you to get even closer again to your subject. So don't worry about the cost. It's not overly expensive to do macro photography. I think this thing cost me £1.80, something like that. The phone's a bit more expensive, but I didn't buy it for that reason. I already had the phone. So if you've got a camera on your phone, then just get a little macro lens like this from eBay or somewhere like that, which is really cheap, and that will make all the difference. One channel I can really recommend on YouTube is Liesl Huddleston, and what she does, she's got a smartphone and one of these, and she takes absolutely amazing photographs of flowers and all things, really close up macro photographs, and her videos are stunning. So I'll put a link to her at the end, and I do urge you to watch those because those are amazing. I found one of our most delicate flowers, and this is a forget-me-not, and these are probably some of the smallest flowers that we have, and to put it into perspective, I'll show you it against my thumb. Even with having a windbreak around them, the slightest breeze makes them move, but they're so tiny and fragile. We've got a 300mm lens with 3 stacked extension tubes, so I can get very close to these flowers here, and I'm so close, the depth of field is almost well, pretty much non-existent. So I've been using f/16 to try and really get some depth of field between the top and the bottom of those, so it's been extremely difficult to get it all in focus. But looking at the image on the back of the camera, that looks really stunning. They're so perfect, these little flowers. So my next tip is that when you go out photographing wildflowers, don't miss any opportunities. This isn't wild, this is it's been planted by the farmer, but this is rape, and this is used for, well, the seed oil is used to make vegetable oil, and this has become quite a popular site now in the UK over the last decade or two. It's been quite controversial, some people like it, some people don't, but it's got this really pungent smell, and it's got this unnatural colour, but there's so many opportunities for taking photographs here. One good tip is just to get a long lens, zoom in on a flower a distance away, and try and capture all this beautiful yellow in the background, and try and blur it all out so you just have one flower in focus and just a massive yellow around it. How beautiful is that? For my next tip, I'll be talking about sunlight, and what you'll get is different opinions on whether you should have sunlight directly on a flower when taking close-up macro photographs. And from a personal point of view, I generally tend not to have the sun in the photograph. And what this does is when the sun is hitting something, so I was photographing these lovely fronds here, and these are bracken fronds, and they'll like unswirl as they grow. And they've got a lovely pattern in them, but earlier the sunlight was directly on them, so the top of these, I don't know, the brown kind of stuff, they're flaking up. As soon as the sun was hitting that, it was just blowing out the highlights. So to stop that happening, I have to really reduce the exposure, and then you get some highlights and blocked up, everything else will be really dark, so there's too much contrast to really get a nice photograph. So what I did instead was to get this umbrella, which is one that I purchased for a studio light, and this was about £1.50, so it's really cheap. So what I'll do is to hold that over the flowers just in front of the sun, so that creates a really nice big softbox, so you get really soft light down on the actual flowers themselves, and that way you don't get a massive contrast, so you can pick up some really beautiful detail and some really vibrant colours in that photograph. That being said, sometimes when you're photographing flowers, a little bit of sunlight on it as well, creating some rim lights or catch lights on the actual flower, could look spectacular. So it does pay to experiment with the photograph you're taking at that time. Another useful tip that I have is to get a field guide for the flowers in your area or nationally. I just go for a quite simple beginner's guide, and that is ideal for picking out the type of flowers that you want to photograph. Now it's useful for telling that these aren't daffodils, but also it will tell you when particular flowers are going to be in flower and where they are located around your area. So you can always go and look for them if you haven't seen them before, or you want a specific flower that you want to go and photograph. Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please get a thumbs up and leave me a comment, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.